Thank you for staying with us, viewers, here in The Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Venezuela's self-declared leader, Juan Guaido, who has said he cannot rule out possible U.S. intervention to provide aid to long-suffering Venezuelans. Nicolas Maduro, still president, has rejected what he's called fake aid, while insisting he is still the only legitimate leader of the country. As the stalemate continues, the military's top brass remains loyal to Maduro. To discuss that a bit further, we're joined now by Victor Mijares, who is a political scientist, joining us from Bogota. He's assistant professor of political science at Los Andes University. We're also joined by Paul Antonopoulos, who is writer at Fort Russ News, and he's joining us from Leeds in the UK. He has a master's in international relations from Western Sydney University. Thank you both for joining us. Victor, I'd like to start with you, if I may, and I wanted to put this, that statement that Guaido has made about not ruling out U.S. intervention. Is that something, do you think, that's a helpful statement to make at this point in time?
Yeah, I think this kind of statement are made in order to have a credible threat over the Maduro's regime and over the military that back Maduro right now. So I think this kind of statement have a strategic direction in order to break the rule, in order to break the coalition that support Maduro. I don't know if this kind of statement are thinking in a way of make this actually real, to deliver forces to Venezuela from Colombia, from the United States. I think this is a threat. They try to make a clear statement for a credible threat, but I think this is more a psychological operation over the Venezuelan military.
And Paul, what do you make of it? Because, I imagine, Paul, that Guaido, too, knows that he has to walk a very fine line, doesn't he? Because I imagine no Venezuelan, especially with the track record that America has in Latin America, would want direct a U.S. intervention.
It would appear that, as Victor correctly said, that this is a psychological attack against the military establishment in Venezuela and also against the leadership. I would say that it could have a very potential realization if we consider even more recent events, not just in Latin America, but even across to the Middle East, where we see what's been happening in Syria and Iraq. And it just appears that a lot of the early rhetoric that we saw before the Syrian war is being repeated in Venezuela. So we've got these sanctions that are coming about. We've got threats of military invasion. We've got open discussions between America and elements of the Venezuelan military trying to persuade them to go against the Maduro government. So it's definitely having a strong psychological effect. However, it remains to be seen whether it will come to realization and whether anyone will, or whether there'll be major defections from the Venezuelan military. So it all remains to be seen so far.
Right. And, Victor, in the middle of this entire crisis are the Venezuelan people themselves. And, the numbers, as you know, Victor, are quite drastic as far as, the lack of medicines in the country, the lack of food in the country, etc. What is your opinion then, Victor, about why Nicolas Maduro is not allowing in U.S. aid?
Well, there are at least two conditions for this. First one is not to show that the project he leads and he heir from Hugo Chavez is now in a broke. Is now completely. It's a complete disaster for the Venezuelan population. So this is the first idea he has in mind. But he's also bearing in mind the idea that actually the United States, Colombia, Brazil, and all the allies against his regime, they are trying to test the resistance, test the loyalty of military. If some military open the borders and this U.S. aid, Colombian aid, enters to Venezuela, that could be, a very strong hit. It's a clash for the loyalty of the military ranks to the central power of Nicolas Maduro. So he don't want to show any weakness in his power structure. So that's the reason why he is not accepting this kind of aid from abroad.
Paul, I mean, from a distance at least, when you're looking at the situation, Paul, it's hard to imagine why, if Nicolas Maduro says he's the legitimate leader, why would he not take aid for his own people? Because certainly, obviously, he's well aware of the economic impact this has had on them vis-a-vis medicines, food, etc.
Great, that's an excellent question, and there are three key points to this. The one is, why should the Venezuelan authorities accept aid from countries or a country that is threatening to invade? That's a very straightforward, simple answer. But let's go a little bit deeper. The second reason, the first one is there are sanctions against the government, recent sanctions where the own US estimates are that it will affect the Venezuelan economy up to 18 billion US dollars. So if you're taking 18 billion US dollars out of the Venezuelan economy and offering them a paltry few $1 million in aid, well, it doesn't really balance, does it? And the third reason I would say is that there is a potential Trojan horse with this aid. Now, there is potential, if we reflect back on what happened in Syria and what happened in Libya, is that often humanitarian aid was also a front cover for weapon smuggling. Now, I'm not saying this is happening in Venezuela, but if we can just reflect on the very, very recent history of American humanitarian aid, then the content of the aid definitely needs to be questioned as well.
Okay, so Victor, let's talk about a few of the American actions, if we may. Let's talk for a moment about Elliot Abrams, the special U.S. envoy for Venezuela. He was appointed by Donald Trump. And as you know well, Victor, Abrams has a track record in Latin America, especially his history when it comes to El Salvador. Do you think that Elliot Abrams was a good choice by America for an envoy for Venezuela?
Actually, let me think more strategically. I think he's a good choice for the proposal they have. And the proposal they have is exactly to break the regime. To break the regime, not only using the force, but threatening with the use of force. In that sense, Mr. Abrahams and Mr. Bolton are, little weapons in this situation. They're trying to be credible threats to the regime. So in that sense, most Latin American scholars looking at Venezuela, looking at the region, thinks, as you say, that, well, this guy has a background in invasions, in overthrowing regimes. So I think the message is, we are not willing to negotiate with you, but only in our own conditions. And that's the message they try to deliver. The White House is trying to deliver to Caracas. And I think in this sense, in the sense of a strategic objective, this is a very good idea.
What do you make of that, Paul? Do you think Abrams fills that role as Victor there described?
It's a very scary proposition. So Trump, before coming to power, his foreign policy was mostly focused on anti-war, pulling America out of conflicts all across the globe. So his platform was to withdraw American involvement across global conflicts. So many of us looking at U.S. foreign policy were very excited with this prospect that finally America will start withdrawing from the Middle East and from various other places across the globe. However, now with the appointment of Mr. Abrams, it appears that all focus is towards realigning American foreign policy towards its so-called backyard. And by appointing Abrams, it does propose a very scary proposition considering his track record across Central America. So just like our colleague in Bogota correctly said, it's a very strong psychological warfare against the central authorities in Caracas. And this will only propel the Venezuelan authorities to continue providing weapons towards militia groups within Venezuela that are pro-government. It will only propel the readiness of the Venezuelan military across its vast borders with Colombia and Brazil. So it's a very, very scary proposition to put someone who's very proud of his track record in Central America, which was very violent and very ugly, and putting them in charge of the situation in Venezuela.
Victor, I wonder if I can just ask you a straightforward question. Do you think, Victor, that America really cares about democracy in Venezuela, or is this about something else, do you think?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's a very straightforward. I will, to answer this in a very straightforward way. No, I'm not sure about this. I don't think even that they are worried about democracy in Venezuela. Not only the Trump administration or other administrations. They want, a secure hemisphere. In this sense, the Venezuelan regime is an enemy of them and their interests. But also, we need to think here in a very realistic way. 85% of Venezuela wants to overthrow Maduro, wants Maduro out of Venezuela, out of power. So in this sense, I'm looking at Venezuelan politicians as Juan Guaido looking for allies, strong allies abroad in order to overthrow Maduro and in order to change economic conditions, or political conditions in Venezuela. This is a very risky gamble, but this is the only gamble Venezuelans have in this very particular and difficult situation. I think this is not about democracy for the rest of power. It's about security. It's about regional security and spheric security and a demonstration of power from the Trump administration. But for Venezuelans, it is actually about democracy, and it is about, better socioeconomic conditions. So I think this is a convenient alliance, not completely based on values, but with different values, with different interests, but with one single objective.
Okay, so Paul, do you think that Venezuelans gain anything out of this? Because, when we're talking about enemies, Pompeo has even thrown in the accusation that Hezbollah is active in Venezuela on the part of supporting Nicolas Maduro's government. Those are very large accusations to make in that region, and knowing, the history with Hezbollah in the Middle East. And, do you think this is all genuinely just about the United States acting out against what it sees as an enemy state?
On the question of Hezbollah, we got to remember that Lebanon is a country of 4 million civilians, in which approximately 25% are Shiite, in which of that 25% who are Shiite, 12.5% are male, and even that 12.5% of Lebanon's very small population are Hezbollah members. So it seems like a very far stretch that a very localized militia group in the Middle East has transcontinental operations across the globe, and especially in America's backyard. If America was concerned about Hezbollah, rather than a military group that has never attacked American soil, I've got to completely reject this assertion, and rather it's just another illegitimate reason for America to point the finger at Muslims. And this time they're pointing the finger at Muslims in South America. So it's a very pathetic excuse to try and justify an American intervention on the purposes of terrorism. But if we're going to talk about the current political crisis, a very key point is that only a week before the current crisis began, a poll was conducted where 81% of Venezuelans had never heard of Guaido before. So if we're going to talk about democracy, how could we replace the current government with someone who was barely known by Venezuelans before this current crisis? So like I said before, to me, I just see this as a reversal of Trump's anti-war policy, and rather he's got all eyes on Venezuela at the moment. And we also have to remember that it was revealed that Guaido was speaking to figureheads of the Trump administration, including his vice president, literally only days before he went out and declared himself as president of Venezuela. So for me, this is just a complete sham. And what many other people across the world don't realize is that Venezuela has been gripped in a severe economic crisis since 1989. That was a whole 10 years before the Bolivarian Revolution. Whether things have improved or not since then, that's something for a very long debate that I don't think we would have time for now. But another crucial question that we cannot miss as well is the global geopolitical ramifications of Venezuela. And what we see right now is that China and Russia are making huge headway in South America, especially in Venezuela, with China being Venezuela's largest trading partner and Russia signing very recently, in the last few weeks, military deals with Venezuela. So for me, America also sees that there's a huge geopolitical threat in its own backyard coming from the emerging powers of China and Russia.
Okay, so Victor, what do you make of those geopolitical implications here? Because, you know, China, Russia, for right now standing very strongly by Nicolas Maduro. So is Iran as well. You know, Uruguay and Mexico have said, let's have some sort of dialogue and mediation in this case. Guaido has rejected that. China has also said that, you know, Venezuelans themselves should decide the future of their country. What do you make of all those implications?
In the U.S. national strategy of 2017, there are very specific mention to Venezuela and the relation of Venezuela with China and Russia as a major threat, as a major hemispheric threat for the United States national interest. So there is a position in which the United States feels that the Russian and Chinese presence, economic presence, military presence in the case of Russia, and the military supply from Moscow to Caracas is a threat to them. But also we need to say that those powers are contesting the presence of the United States in Eurasia, the presence and the relation of allies, military troops, military vessels of the United States in Asia and Central and East Europe. So this situation is a major gamble. We are looking only in the case of Venezuela. It's a very focused case in Latin America. This is very, have all the spotlight because this is not common in Latin America. Most of the cases, most of the crises in Latin America are around the relation of the Latin America with the United States and, always within the hemisphere, but not with this extra-regional powers. Hugo Chavez bring all these powers to Latin America in order to balance the power of the United States. Now the situation is critical. It's critical simply because the Chinese had a lot of money invested in Venezuela. Right. They are the greatest creditors of Venezuela, and now the Russians are backing Maduro's. And I'm not sure, how long this backing will endure, but I'm pretty sure that Vladimir Putin is more committed to Nicolas Maduro than the Chinese ranks.
Okay. We're going to leave that as our word, gentlemen, but of course we appreciate both of your insights and analysis as provided in this very important segment on Venezuela. That was Victor Mijares, political scientist, speaking to us from Bogota. We're also joined by Mr. Paul Antonopoulos, writer at Fort Ross News, and he was speaking to us from Leeds in the UK. And our viewers, of course, this crisis in Venezuela continues at this point. We did, of course, have that very significant statement by Guaido saying he may not block any U.S. intervention if he feels the need for something like that to go ahead. He, of course, must realize that is playing with fire, considering the Venezuelan people very well know the American track record when it comes to interventions in Latin America in the past. We'll keep a very close eye on that developing situation, the economic situation in the country, of course, getting worse. Aid to be blocked at the borders, aid that America, of course, has sent. Maduro saying his country does not want, quote unquote, fake aid. Well, we'll keep a close eye, as I said, on that situation in Venezuela here in The Scope. But thanks for watching. I've been Vows.